I say to Syrians and non-Syrian allies is that engage with Syria. Come to Syria. Visit Aleppo, Damascus, Hamas, Hama. Soon the airport is going to be open. It indicates that where they could have trusted these weapons in the hands of Bashar and his father, now they cannot trust these weapons in the hands of any newly controlling party. Because the likelihood of that controlling party is that once it stabilizes and starts governing and starts responding and becoming more representative of the Syrian people and the will of the Syrian people, that it will gravitate naturally towards resisting Israel. They did not enter Damascus, with vengeance and violence and all that stuff. They
Hmm.
kept making statements. HDS kept making statements that, we're here, we want the transition to be as smooth as possible.
Syria is finally free after 54 years of brutal oppression under the Assad regime. In just 11 days, rebel forces moved at lightning speed, taking major cities like Aleppo, Hama, and Homs. And in an incredible moment of unity, they entered Damascus peacefully, bringing an end to decades of tyranny and opening a new chapter for the Syrian people. Social media is flooded with powerful images of joyful reunions, prisoners being freed from Assad's notorious prisons, and jubilant celebrations in the street, a testament to the resilience and hope of the Syrian people. Today, I'm speaking with Yaser Tabbara, a seasoned human rights lawyer and co founder and chief strategist of the Syrian Forum Humanitarian Organization. Drawing on his extensive experience in international human rights law and his work with the International Bar Association on judicial reform in Syria and Iraq, Tabara will help us understand the swift pace of recent events, the composition of various rebel groups, and how these developments impact both the region and the Palestinian struggle for freedom. Most crucially, we'll explore the vital question: what does the future hold for Syrians, both within and outside their homeland? Yasser Tabara, assalamu alaikum, and welcome to the American Muslim Dialogue.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Pleasure to be on this show. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, alhamdulillah. So I just wanted to first get your thoughts and your feelings. How are you feeling? How are Syrians feeling about the past 11 days, almost 2 weeks?
Well, it's a mix of sort of like a dreamlike sort of feeling that Syrians, most if not all Syrians, on all the entire spectrum, have probably never thought this day would come this, at this time, at this point. Syrians have been basically under a more than 5 decades of an incredibly brutal, incredibly bloody regime of dictatorship. And, people like myself who were born in the 70s and grew up in Syria, in Damascus, knew nothing but the Assad family and, the incredibly brutal Assad's rule. And so for us to arrive at a moment where we could actually now think that not only our kids, but ourselves would be able to, walk the streets of Damascus or Homs or Aleppo or Deir ez-Zor with without that sort of heaviness that comes with this context and this history and this, incredible repression is really dreamlike. Um, though what happened in the past 11 days also makes people a bit sort of nervous. So a lot of people are, watching with, let's call it, uh, optimistic caution that what will come hopefully would not uh, spoil 14 years of intense sacrifice and intense struggle for real change in Syria in terms of moving to from one system of authoritarian, bloody dictatorship to hopefully a more pluralistic, democratic system of governance that really respects Syrians as human beings and as citizens, and sees them as, or treats them as equal. And I think an extremely important point here is that it is really upon us right now as Syrians to make sure that takes place.
So a lot of social media, there's a lot of a campaign of disinformation, and some people are doubtful about how this opposition appeared from out of nowhere and took cities over a matter of days. And questions arise of how did this happen and what's really the deeper story, if you can share with us.
Well, first of all, it's not an opposition that came out of nowhere. This is a consortium of armed factions that have basically formed as early as 2012. The Syrian Revolution was part of the Arab Spring in 2011, and it started as an entirely peaceful revolution that basically took the streets. People took the streets of major cities and villages all over Syria, all across Syria, and for months on end, nobody took a violent route to do anything about a regime change or anything like that in terms of sort of Syrian people and the Syrian will. The um, the military factions and the guys with the guns basically came about in a mix of sort of organic circumstances where local communities, found themselves having to defend themselves after the regime basically responded to these massive peaceful protests with live ammunition. And so we would see scenes of, major protests, thousands of people taking the streets, protesting peacefully versus, security forces and military forces shooting at them with, snipers on rooftops, even tanks, basically facing these protests. And when we saw an increase of, or the Syrian people or these factions saw an increase of that type of behavior from the regime, slowly, the idea of resistance emerged, and people started, getting weapons and organizing themselves into local factions, and a lot of, I mean, that is the sort of the origin story of a lot of the fighting factions. This is also not to deny that there are groups that sought external support from all sorts of different uh, governments and states and entities, and formed more of the violent extremist type of ideology, and we're also part of that mix. So that's sort of like the context on how the revolution sort of transformed from a purely civil, peaceful movement calling for change. It wasn't even calling for regime change, it was calling for reform. Then it, gradually called for a regime change when it saw how, things were being dealt with, and then it became weaponized to literally defend local communities. Because the amount of violence and the type of violence that was used by uh, the state itself and by the militias aligned with the states, which had a very sectarian undertone to it, um, made a lot of these local communities very nervous, and that prompted them to defend themselves and pick up arms. Now, on regarding what happened in the past 11 days, so there are Syria has become an extremely complex sort of place for uh, those who have not been following the the situation on the ground there over the past 14 years. And so we got to a place where we have different areas of control, controlled by different, basically, de facto governments and military groups. And so we had the Northeast being controlled by militias that mostly Kurdish militias, but that are aligned with the um, an extremist and a listed designated basically group called SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, which are connected to another group in Turkey and elsewhere, and then and incidentally became supported by the United States. And then we had, the areas controlled by the government, by the central government, by the Assad regime, which effectively are controlled by the Russian military and the Iranian militias and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And then we had areas that are controlled by other factions in the north and in the south, in the northwest and in the south. Some of these factions were also, supported by Turkey in the north, and then some of them were a little more independent. In Idlib, the province of Idlib, which is in the northwest of Syria, a group that originally was affiliated with Al Qaeda. It was an extremist jihadist group called Al Nusra, Jabhat al Nusra, led by a man named Abu Muhammad al Julani. Now we know him as Ahmad al Shara, a Syrian from Damascus, who went through sort of like a very intense journey that started in Iraq when around the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and then brought him back to Syria around the time when these local factions were being formed. And that group later on consolidated a lot of power, controlled more territory. A number of military factions ended up joining and merging into it. And slowly it became slowly it started transforming into a different type of governance project, because they had control over most of the province of Idlib, and
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden they found themselves having to govern an area that had a few million people. And so uh, that project, represented by Ahmad Shara himself, was, if you really look at the timeline, that where they started and where they ended up right before we heard about the 11 days that led us to the toppling of the regime of Bashar al-Assad, you'll see that they disengaged from Al Qaeda completely, that they have made a number of announcements in that direction, that they have declared that they're no longer a transnational jihadist group, that their aspirations was to specifically liberate Syria. And then slowly, towards 2022, 2023, 2024, you'll start seeing that they've established a functional government called the Salvation Government, with you know technocratic individuals running it. And all of a sudden, if you look at the entire map of Syria from a services point of view and security point of view, you'll see that these different areas of control, the most stable and the most prosperous, relatively speaking, of course, because Syria, you cannot use the word prosperous with Syria over the past few decades, but relatively speaking, the area that these guys controlled were the relatively the most livable, if you will. They started then, they made some announcements right before this 11-day thing that they will be going to Idlib, going to Aleppo, and they will be liberating Aleppo. Not a lot of people believe them, but apparently they had, been well prepared, and they went ahead and went into Aleppo. When Aleppo sort of fell in the speed, the relative ease that it did, they decided to continue onwards, and that's where they kept going to Hama, and then to Homs, and then other military factions in the south, which are not affiliated with them but are in coordination with them, decided to regroup and reorganize and start marching to Damascus. All of this was happening in a very interesting geopolitical context, and that context was extremely important to the success of this group to actually take over the entire or most of the country. And that context is that the Assad regime, in its incredible brutal way of repressing any people or any communities that have been liberated from it, was relying heavily on two elements that
Mhm.
uh, analysts think that without them, the Assad regime would have been gone long, long ago.
And I think you're talking about Hezbollah and Russia.
Correct. Not just
Right.
Hezbollah, but a lot of Iranian affiliated militias.
Iranian. Right.
Yes, that came through Iraq and other places as well. There are, Afghani militias, and a lot of them were unfortunately also sectarian and moved by that type of motivation. And
Mhm.
so, when Russia decided that, there's another context to all of this as well, where, I mean, because that's the thing, I don't know how much your audience know about what has been taking place in Syria over the past at least, few years, as far as the political process is concerned, and as far as the actual on the ground control. So that's why I'm giving that
No,
sort of
and
context.
I think it's important for that context because Syria was out of the limelight for a very long time, and it took the world by storm, literally, not just Syrians with, the rebel advancements. No, please continue. And I actually wanted to take you back to, I know you're referring to Hayat Tahrir Sham and their takeover of Syria. I think one of the questions that keeps arising because of their checkered past with starting with ISIS and then Al Qaeda is their treatment or their potential treatment of Christians and other minority groups in Syria, the fear of basically taking away their rights and imposing whatever ideology, religious ideology they have at the moment. Can you speak to us a little bit about that and what people are saying? It's only been a couple of days when they've taken over the country, so any thoughts you can share?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, this is a fear that is shared by most Syrians, including myself. Although, again, what we've seen has been, let's say, um, sort of, you know, I don't want to use the word reassuring, but a lot of these, a lot of the, I mean, for example, they've controlled Idlib for a very long time. Idlib had Druze communities, had Ismaili communities, had Christian communities, and had a lot of the sort of the Syria, what makes the Syrian tapestry in terms of different societies and communities and affiliations, and they've, for the most part, held a very decent scorecard and record in terms of treating these communities and protecting them and making sure that nobody basically does anything to mess with them. Uh, when they when they went into Aleppo at the beginning of the 11-day liberation battle, if you will, a lot of because Aleppo is also has a sizable Christian community, and in fact, it has, I think, if I'm not mistaken, close to 11 Christian denominations
Mm,
in Aleppo alone.
mm,
There was a huge fear that how these people are going to be treated. Are they going to be hurt? Are they going to be forced out, etc. And one of the first public messaging that came out of Ahmed Shara's and HTS at the time was a very very clear message that these people are Syrians, they're equal citizens. We don't see them as any different, but we as the controlling party now will it's upon us to protect them and protect them like we protect any other Syrian communities. They engaged in meetings with them, and the feedback from those from the Christian leadership in their various denominations was very positive. And this is something that
mm.
is out there. I mean, it's not a conspiracy. You can see videos and statements and from
Sure.
both sides. Um, you know, I mean, a lot of skeptical people, including myself, I have to say, have been saying, well, they're saying the right thing so they can get, to control all of Syria and to appease the international community and then move forward. But to be honest with you, I mean, I don't know, I don't know. Uh, they keep saying the right things when it comes to, their positionality on minorities and the Syrian tapestry and citizenship and all of that stuff. They're not using jihadists, Salafist sort of traditional terminology. They're using modern states type of terminology, equal citizens,
And even they
citizenship.
took down their flag, right? The flag, there was an uproar when, I forgot who met, but in that meeting in HES, they had the Shahada flag, which, most Syrians are Muslim, but because of the outrage and fear of what that might entail, they responded and took it down, which was interesting.
Yeah, so Ahmed Shara is a military sort of leader, appointed a temporary government led by a gentleman by the name of Mohammed al-Bashir, a technocrat, who was also part of the government that governed Idlib for a while.
Mhm,
And Mohammed Bashir, who was beginning his duties in terms of taking over from the previous ministers in the regime government, which was an extremely interesting transition as well, or it was a sight to be seen, really, because they did not enter Damascus, with vengeance and violence and all that stuff. They
mhm.
kept making statements. HDS kept making statements that we're here. We want to use. We want the transition to be as smooth as possible. We want to engage with the previous technocrats of the previous governments, and we want to make sure that there's very high level coordination between the two. And again, I mean, these are all documented. Nobody had a gun to his head or her head in the
Mhm.
previous government, and so they had a number of very fruitful engagements. Anyways, so Hamad Bashir became the new head of the government, the temporary government, which is supposedly gonna uh, govern for the next 3 months, and then we
Mm.
all are hoping that, or according to HTS, a transitional political process and a governance process that is commensurate with the what the Syrian people have been wanting in terms of achieving a pluralistic democracy will commence. Now, Bashir, in one of the meetings, had the revolution flag, which is now this new Syrian flag that replaced
Mhm.
the old regime flag. And,
Mhm.
and right next to it, he had the Nusra flag, which had the Shahada on it.
Yeah.
And for that, he got a lot of flack from. And see, that's another context. So over the past 14 years, I mean, you have to understand that prior to the Syrian revolution, the regime was so incredibly brutal. And this is, by the way, this is another context that a lot of people who spread the misinformation or fall for the misinformation and sort of drink that Kool-Aid do not, I think, know or understand. The amount of brutality and
Mm.
oppression is is unhuman like. I mean, the amount of fear that Syrians lived over these decades, it prevented them from developing any meaningful civil society, any meaningful political society, any meaningful political participation or party establishment. And so a lot of Syrians were not really ready in 2011. It was a revolution, part of the Arab Spring, but
Mhm.
capacities weren't there. But over the past 14 years, a lot of that capacity was built. A lot of now you have you can say that you have a Syrian political class now. You can say that you have politicos, political actors, political animals that understand governance and citizenship and what is it like to build a state or state institutions and all that stuff. You can say that now there's a civil society is that has a very clear narrative on very important issues and that has the ability to push these narratives forward on and knows how to activate and where to and how to put pressure on
Mhm.
those with guns and with the control. And so that pressure, basically, a lot of people were just angry and which were not satisfied that he had that other flag sitting next to the new Syrian flag, and he responded. They responded to the pressure, and in a latter interview, we just saw the Syrian flag, the new Syrian flag behind him, in a clear indication that they listen, they respond, they process, they care about what the Syrian people are saying. But again, I mean, a lot of us are just cautiously optimistic, and the caution comes
Mhm.
from the fact that at the end of the day, this is a group that also is comprised of a spectrum of elements and individuals that range in terms of radicalism and in terms of extreme ideology, and there are the moderate currents within the group which seem to be more in control, represented by Ahmed Shara himself, who you can see has transformed, from being affiliated with ISIS in Iraq to all the way starting to act like a statesman uh, in Idlib prior to this liberation battle, and in Damascus now.
Mhm.
And I don't know if you saw the CNN interview with him that aired a couple of days ago. I strongly recommend your viewers to see it so they can understand more of how this guy has transformed how he thinks and how he engages with people.
I think it was the first major interview he gave over an international media, correct?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and in that interview, basically, he was asked very tough questions. Again, some people say, well, he's just being coached to say the right things, and a lot of us are gonna continue to wait and see. But I think again, the difference between the type of resistance that took place in 2011 and the type of resistance that will take place today, should another dictatorship, God forbid, form in Damascus, is completely different in terms of size, capacity, ability. And I'm talking now about political opposition, civil society,
Mhm.
and people who are very, very tired of repression and will not stand for any of that. So let's see. Inshallah, very hopeful
Inshallah.
that this continues to go in the right direction.
And I wanted to talk a little bit about Syria vis-a-vis what's happening right now with Israel. going into Quneitra, taking over Mount Hernon, and then also, expanding beyond the Golan Heights that they already illegally occupy. Some point to the fact that he really hasn't come out against that. There hasn't been any like pronouncements or objections to what's going on there. And some people point to that perhaps he's getting the green light from U.S. and by extension Israel for being able to take over Syria and lead Syria to a to a new path. So I wanted to get your thoughts about what is happening as far as HTS and Israel right now.
So, first of all, I don't think it's accurate to say that they never made any announcements on this Israeli incursion. I think they have. They've condemned it, but that's not. I mean, that's not terribly relevant because you know if you don't act, I mean, you can make all the statements in the world. I mean, that's what Bashar al-Assad and Hafiz al-Assad did for decades. All they did is they made statements, and everybody sort of knew that Bashar and Hafiz uh, and their cohorts and the regimes and all of that in reality had very little interest in fighting Israel and in liberating the Golan Heights. And, uh, instead, I think they were viewed because of their destabilizing role and creating, or making Syria into an incredibly destabilizing factor in sort of like the regional security architecture. That was always mistaken by their uh, ideological leaning towards resistance and resisting the Israeli agenda and the Israeli occupation of Palestine and all that stuff.
Mhm.
And I think that is a falsity that just a lot of people just fall into. Um, since the liberation of Damascus, the Israelis have destroyed the majority of via airstrikes, the majority of Syrian regime army, or Syria's weaponry.
Mhm.
Um, there were like hundreds of airstrikes and then they've declared that they made a declaration that I think the exact number of strikes that they made. If that indicates anything to a lot of Syrians who understood who Bashar was and who Hafiz was, and understand the geopolitical context very well, it indicates that where they could have trusted these weapons in the hands of Bashar and his father, now they cannot trust these weapons in the hands of any newly controlling party. Because the likelihood of that controlling party is that once it stabilizes and starts governing and starts responding and becoming more representative of the Syrian people and the will of the Syrian people, that it will gravitate naturally towards resisting Israel, violent resistance of Israel. And I mean, this is a doctrine that all of Syrians have grew up with, and it's not just because we grew up in a certain education system that is controlled by propaganda and all that, but it's because we genuinely, as Syrians, consider Palestine and the liberation of the Palestinian people as a central issue to us as Arabs, as Muslims, for those who identify with Islam in Syria, but also all Syrians. I mean, whoever you talk to, wherever you talk to them, the overwhelming majority, consider that to be an extremely important issue.
Mhm.
So, for us to say that, um, this liberation that rid the Syrian people of unimaginable amount of suffering and fear and repression and brutality, not just in terms of you know security forces and dungeons underground and torture and prisons. I mean, now I think some human rights organizations are declaring that the 160,000 detainees and forcefully disappeared people by the regime are now dead because they haven't found them in any of the dungeons or prisons. So not just only because of that, but also in the way that the regime has dealt with peaceful communities that were resisting and liberated from their control by throwing these dumb barrel bombs on these communities and killing, indiscriminately a massive amount of civilians, women, children, men, markets, schools, bakeries, in countless cities. I mean, this is all documented. This is not some sort of propaganda. This is not and so I think really, I've been incredibly frustrated as someone who has taken it upon myself to be part of that resistance agenda of the Israeli occupation of and the suffering of the Palestinian people. As someone who's been an activist in that realm for decades before we got to the point of Syria's liberation, it really, really depresses me and saddens me to see that a lot of our supposed, allies on the human rights, those who espouse human rights values and the liberation of the oppressed people and all of that, basically looking at this as a threat to the Palestinian cause. I mean, there are incredible amount of reports that document the brutality through which the Assad regime dealt with Palestinians in Syria, Palestinian communities in Syria, and how, for example, Mukhayyam Yarmouk is a major one. How when it rose up along with other Syrians, how it basically was dealt with the most inhumane way by sieging it, starving many people to death, and destroying any inkling of resistance in it. There's another example which is a lot more graphic and gruesome, the the Tadamun massacre, also in a Palestinian concentrated area in Damascus, or southern Damascus, where there was a Guardian expose on this a few years ago, where there were actual video footage of regime soldiers basically shooting people and throwing them into a pit full of bodies, then throwing people alive, blindfolded, and then shooting them when they're. I mean, it's just incredible bestiality and brutality. And so, what I ask of whoever is viewing this, that is aligned with, or that is sort of consuming that sort of line of thought, that the Syrian liberation as it's manifested today is a threat to the Palestinian cause. What I say is that, first of all, I need you to understand the type of fear and brutality that Syrians have lived over the past 50 years, specifically over the past 14 years. Try to understand that. And I'm very sorry, I'm about to give an example actually that I'm very hesitant to, but even Yahya Sinwar himself, who was detained by Israeli prisons, was subject to a certain amount of medical treatment, or this is not to say that Israeli prisons mistreat detainees. They do, and they mistreat detainees to a gruesome extent. But I just want you to take a step and imagine and look at the footage and the images that are coming out of Syrian prisons, that were administered by the Syrian regime. And I
The
mean,
Sednaya images are horrific.
we're getting to a point where we're realizing that the Syrian regime is probably going to be an example. I mean, it's one of the most advanced regimes in terms of torture methodology and horrific conditions of any detainees. So any resolution of that should be welcome news. That's as
Mhm,
far as This is you're talking to someone who is a bit apprehensive about what's going to come in Syria in terms of governance, in terms of those who are controlling Damascus right now, and all of that. I have an incredible sense of relief that
mhm,
as a Syrian, I don't have to worry about my people, my family, my children, um, my relatives to endure that anymore.
mhm. And I wanted to actually ask you a little bit about the United States' role also, as well as far as its backing of any of the rebel factions that, and I think you're referring to the imperialist left narrative that anything against Israel and US is good. So Hezbollah is okay. The crimes by Hezbollah, the crimes by Iran, the crimes by Russia is okay. So as far as you know, is there any United States role in helping the rebels?
Zero, as far as I know, zero. And you're talking to someone who's heavily involved. You introduced me as a co-founder of the Syrian Forum. The Syrian Forum is not just a humanitarian organization. We actually, when we started the organization in 2012, we built it with the understanding that this is a very long-term process. We're about long-term change. We're not about just an Arab Spring revolution that is going to topple a regime and that's it. And so, with that understanding, we built a number of long-term development programs. We built a think tank that is Syria-centric. It's called the Ummah Center for Strategic Studies. I encourage those who want to learn more about the specifics of Syria and geopolitical issues and policy
Mhm,
issues, the political process, all that stuff, to actually read some of our work. Um, we have economic empowerment programs. We have we have an advocacy arm as well. We have a lot of programs. So what I'm trying to tell you is that you're talking to someone who understands sort of the context, follows the events on the grounds, follows sort of the affiliations and who responds to who. And I can tell you with a certain level of confidence that there is a great deal of agency. There was a great deal of agency and a great deal of independence in terms of what took place over the past couple of weeks.
mhm,
Yes, HTS probably got a green light from the Turks to move. Although what we know is that it wasn't a total green light, and even the Turks didn't know that they will go all the way to Damascus. There
mhm,
was, an idea of pushing Bashar al-Assad to sit down at the negotiating table and finally resolve the Syrian issue politically. And in order for them to do that, I think they tacitly approved or tacitly was okay with HTS going into Aleppo. So
mhm,
they so the other side of the equation in the Syrian equation would be able to force the Assad regime to sit down and negotiate and end the suffering of the Syrian people, the economic woes and the infrastructural destruction and the brutality in prisons and all that stuff. And so when they got again to Aleppo, they rolled on, and I don't think anybody approved that. I don't think the U.S. approved that. I don't think um, uh, they didn't get any material support from any of these countries. There are obviously again, as things happen very quickly. Now we are at a stage
mhm,
where okay, this U.S. is starting to make statements, the EU starting to make statements on potentially recognizing these people as or delisting the HTS from being a terrorist organization in exchange for them changing behavior on certain issues and guaranteeing some things in terms of political transition. But yes, believe it when I mean, and a lot of people are going to be skeptical about this, and I was, but
Hmm.
we're seeing a lot of agency and independence in some of these decisions. And certainly the US, certainly the Biden administration. I mean, let me tell you about the perception of the educated perception of a lot of Syria analysts about what the role of the Biden administration in Syria.
Hmm.
A lot of us see it as a continuation of the Obama doctrine of we call it a 2.0 of the Obama, because a lot of these similar people in the administration basically came into the Biden administration, in terms of national
Hmm.
security advisors, in terms of State
Right.
Department actors and all that. And these people had a very straightforward doctrine that basically prioritized making a deal with Iran, the nuclear weapon deal with Iran, and one of the prices and one of the negotiating chips on that was to let Iran's hand free in Syria,
Hmm.
and for Iran to continue to engage and support the regime of Bashar al-Assad, and for Iran to continue to have a foothold in Syria.
Hmm.
And it wasn't, that was always I mean, that's the perception, and that's really the reality in a lot of ways. And
Hmm.
so for us to say now that the US decided to support HTS to actually, take over Damascus and topple the Syrian regime, I think is absolutely ridiculous if you're looking at it from that context and that perspective.
And I think that ignores the fact that Russia is an imperial power and so is Iran. And it's a little bit misguided as far as their line of thinking. So I want to get back to maybe the future. Like, what lessons can Syria learn from both the successes and failures of the Arab Spring as it works to establish a new government?
Um, that's an excellent question, and that's the question that is on everybody's mind, really. I think Shara and those in Damascus need to listen to, the will of the Syrian masses. Um, they need to engage with Syrian civil society and the Syrian political actors. Syrians cannot get complacent, now that we have gotten rid of, again, dreamlike, I mean, I'm going to Damascus for first time in, I don't know, 15 years.
Wow.
And and I cannot, I mean, I'm hopefully leaving today, and I still cannot fathom how I'm going to be feeling. And
Mhm.
in order for us to keep that, we cannot get complacent. And what we always say as a Syrian Forum to our supporters and to those we engage with is that, believe it or not, the real work just started. You know, the past 14 years were like a prep to
Mhm.
get us to a point where we assert ourselves as civil actors, make sure that the guys with guns are controlled and that are playing the role that they're supposed to in terms of reestablishing the Syrian state and the Syrian state's institutions, and
Mhm.
for us to push for a robust, sustainable political process that includes all of Syrian um, diversity
Mhm.
and response to the need of all the Syrians, while maintaining a high level of service delivery and technical expertise. And I think that is our challenge. Now, the
Hmm.
good news of all of this is that, Syrians, especially Syrian diasporas, especially Syrian American communities.
That's exactly you're going right into my next question is what do you see the role of Syrians outside of Syria who've left, throughout the years and not just Syrian, the Ummah basically.
Yeah. Um, we are about to launch this initiative, this campaign at the Syrian Forum, and it's branded Syria Needs You. In Arabic, Surya Bidayak. And it's a campaign that aims at basically engaging Syrians finally in rebuilding their own country. And so we're establishing a platform where we could match expertise with challenges and problems and all of that. Again, the good news is that specifically Syrian Americans, actually, and Syrians across the globe, have
Mhm.
this affinity and this affiliation that is just undying, and have this sort of loyalty and this motivation, this incredible motivation to go back. And I mean, just immediately after the liberation, you saw a number of local initiatives, cleaning streets. And yesterday I saw this incredible thing. We saw the footage. If you remember, of the first day, there was a lot of looting of the presidential palace and
Mhm.
other public entities. And yesterday there was like a local initiative that actually came out of a mosque, one of the most revered mosques in Damascus. It was actually a mosque that a lot of people say one of the initial sparks of protest in Damascus in 2011 came out of. That basically called for people to return the loot, and the amount of engagement and response was just astounding.
Mm.
In terms of like people returning cars, I mean, like
Wow.
big ticket
Mashallah.
items. And um, I mean, that is incredibly encouraging. And so what I say to Syrians and non-Syrian allies is that engage with Syria. Come to Syria. Visit Aleppo, Damascus, Hamas, Hama. Soon the airport is going to be open. Deir Zor, Dara,
Mm.
everywhere. Ladiyah, Tartus, and come to Syria. Assert yourself if you're a Syrian. You know that you're going to be there. You're going to rebuild. You're going to spend time. You're going to sacrifice some of your time and your effort and money and resources. And if you're not Syrian, come with the idea of engaging and helping to make sure that we rebuild this place that has been subject to so much misery and pain and suffering and sadness, especially over the past 14 years.
Mhm. I mean, it's a victory for the whole Ummah. Syria has a special place in the Ummah's collective heart and imagination. I wanted to ask you finally, is there anything that inspires you? I'm sure the revolution inspires you, but anything, Quran ayah or a surah that inspires you in your work in helping the Syrian people?
I've always been inspired as a lawyer, as someone with legal background. Because, by the way, that's a another track we didn't cover. But I have a background in international criminal law, and one of the things that I've been working on personally is ensuring, hopefully, that Bashar al-Assad and whoever committed gross human rights violations are responsible for the imagery that we're seeing today and seen over the past years, to actually be brought to
Mhm.
justice, whether it's the
Yeah.
International Criminal Court or others. And so my inspiration always uh, is the incredible. I mean, to me as a Muslim, one of the most fundamental sources of belief for me is how justice oriented our faith is. And so, there's an ayah that says, وَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ خَيْرًا يَرَى وَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ شَرًّا يَرَى. That God is saying that, you know, whatever you do, whether it's an iota of goodness, you'll see goodness, and an iota of evil, you'll see evil. And so, to me, that manifests or that summarizes, this whole idea of justice. God is promising justice, and I think without that promise, honestly, with the incredible brutality across the entire world, human history, it just would be unbearable for us to continue.
Hmm. Well, thank you for your time, Brother Yasser. May Allah help you and help all Syrians to rebuild and the Ummah to rise again from the ashes. May Allah reward you and the work you and your team does.
Ameen ya Rabbal Alameen. And thank you so much. Jazakallah khair. And, appreciate the opportunity.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
If you enjoyed the episode, please like, share, subscribe, and comment below. It helps the channel to reach more people and bring you more quality content. Also, visit our Patreon page to support independent media that features timely discussions relevant to you and the American Muslim community. Thank you for your support.